USDA ARS based out of Stuttgart, Arkansas. It's going to talk about copper sulfate, toxicity to various fish, role of alkalinity and hardness. Thank you, Dave.
Okay. Thanks, Gary. I think I titled this wrong. The reason I wanted to come to this meeting was to tell the extension people what I've been doing to get the word out. So I don't know how much into the toxicity I'm going to go, just to tell you that we're doing it, I guess. My name is Dave Straus, or some people know me as Dr. Copper Sulfate. Some people also know me as Big D. So anyway, I work in Stuttgart. I've been there for quite a while. I was hired there to work on copper sulfate to try to get it approved. There was a group put together back in the late 90s or in the mid 90s, and they wanted to get a bunch of drugs approved because there was a crackdown from the Fish and Wildlife Service that we needed to get more medicines to use out there. So I was hired there for this, and they knew it was a long-term project. It's just turned into a lot longer than was originally thought, I think. Part of that, when I was hired, I think I had a boss that wanted to get it done, and then we had another boss come in that wasn't that concerned about getting it done, and then the latest boss wants to get it done. Then I ran into the problem that the company that made the copper sulfate quit making copper sulfate. So now where we are is I'm in talks with the manufacturer, or patiently waiting for them to make a commitment to become the sponsor of copper sulfate so we can get this whole ordeal finished. Jen went through some of the things that we have to do to try to get a drug approved. We have to show how effective, this is about some of the stuff that we've done in our lab, but we have to show how effective it is at doing what we say it'll do, and we have to show how safe it is. Those are the important things. We have to show how safe it is to the humans that are going to consume the fish, how safe it is to the fish that we're going to treat to cure, and how safe it is for the environment. With copper sulfate, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a label for it for the control of ick on channel catfish in earthen ponds. And for that label, everything is approved. For the effectiveness, we have a completion letters from the FDA for the effectiveness of it at doing this job, for the safety to humans, for the safety to the environment, and for the safety to the fish. The last thing that is remaining, the major things that are remaining, is the manufacturing that she mentioned before. And the technical section for that is called the Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Control section, or basically how the copper sulfate company makes the copper sulfate, how they store it, and everything that's involved with the manufacturing process. So basically it's a complex report from the manufacturer on this, and we're just waiting to get a sponsor lined up so that he can do this. So what we're trying to do is get a label for the control of ick on catfish, and then the second label we get, and this was brought up in the mid-2000s, is that farmers were interested in using copper sulfate to treat for fungus control on fish eggs. So the second label we're trying to get is for the control of fungus on channel catfish eggs in a hatchery. Everything has been done and signed off on that except for the environmental safety report, and we're waiting to get a sponsor involved so that they make a commitment to get the first label, and then we will go ahead and get this environmental safety section done. So we're making progress on this, but we need to get the sponsor involved, and like I said, I'm anxiously waiting. So what I wanted to do is give you a history of the use of copper sulfate and try to convince you to talk to your people when they come, since you're extension agents, when these people come to you asking, say, hey, I've got these fish, how can they be treated? Remember copper sulfate. One of the things I do want to mention that Jan didn't mention in her talk, and I was going to ask a question but we ran out of time, is INADs. You probably have all heard about INADs, Investigational New Animal Drug Exemptions. Well, those are for drugs that are in the pipeline that need to be used. Well, when they first set up this whole thing in the mid-90s, or I think it was in the late 90s, everything that was being worked on had to have an INAD exemption, and these cost money, and you have to do reporting and everything. They had to have an INAD exemption to use these compounds. Copper sulfate and potassium permanganate were put under a category that there was no INAD that was needed for these. the drugs are not approved, but regulatory action is deferred as long as we were doing research trying to get these approved. Well, the potassium permanganate people weren't interested in pursuing this very far, so they kind of dropped by the wayside. But you can now use copper sulfate. It's not approved, but you can use it as long as we're trying to get this label finished. And that's one misconception. A lot of people out there, and it's actually been in some scientific papers, say that you have to have an INAD for copper sulfate. You don't need an INAD to do this. And maybe Jen can talk about that later on if there's any questions about it. So anyway, we've done a lot of work with copper sulfate in our lab. Drew Mitchell, who used to be there, did a lot of work to try to get the EPA registration for snail control when the catfish trematode became a problem. So he did some emergency research and got the EPA to expand the label. So that's why Drew's picture's out there for the snail control and the trematodes. And then we've done a lot of work with ick in our lab, and especially with egg fungus lately. Let's see, so move ahead. So we started working with this. Actually, I started working this when I was working with Craig Tucker out in Stoneville back in the late 80s. We were dumping copper sulfate in the pond, and the pond just turned milky where the copper sulfate was, and I was fascinated by it. So that's kind of what I got involved with and have made a lot of my career with it. It's a compound that's approved by the EPA as an algicide, fungicide, insecticide, water treatment, and molluscicide. It's not a restricted use pesticide like some other compounds. The farmers have used it forever to control ick in ponds, and as I said, as of in the 2000s, they wanted to get it also approved for fungus on fish eggs. So it's a very economical product, and I'll show you about that here in a minute. So as I mentioned, we started this program in the 90s, and there's the 2 FDA labels that I mentioned also. So the only FDA-approved compounds for eggs, for fungus control on fish eggs, are formalin and hydrogen peroxide. So we looked into this, did a cost, about how much did it cost to treat a trough of catfish eggs. And if you haven't seen the trough of catfish eggs, Leo has some ancient ones out there that were made out of 55-gallon drums, half barrels. But these are about 2 feet wide, 10 feet long. And the farmers put the eggs in, the catfish eggs in baskets, and there's a rotating paddle that goes around there to simulate the male's fanning of the eggs. So anyway, to treat one of those troughs with hydrogen peroxide, which is approved to treat it, it costs 89 cents. To treat a trough with formalin just one time, and these troughs had to be repeatedly treated daily throughout this whole spawning season, with formalin it costs 73 cents. But if you take copper sulfate and use it, it costs 2 cents, which is just amazing that there's such a great price difference. So the work that we've done at Stuckart, we started out with channel catfish eggs in the hatching troughs that I just described. And we found out that 10 parts per million was the concentration you need. And that's what these prices I have up here, the ones in red are based on the approved treatment rates, and the copper sulfate is based on the 10 part per million that are described down here. So we did it for channel catfish, and then farmers, I think 2/3 of the, and I worked with Jim Stevie. I don't know if Jim's here. I saw, there he is. Worked with Jim Stevie on this, and we estimated that 2/3 of the catfish industry is using it. This was several years ago. So we were over talking with Mike Freeze over at Keogh and went out to talk to his hatchery manager, and he asked us what we could, this was about 3 years later, asked us what we could do with these problems. He was getting fungus on his eggs. So I started kind of drooling. I guess I was so excited because I knew exactly what we could do. So we set up this experiment and worked out there during their hatching season because we wanted to do it at a production facility. And he hatches these eggs in a McDonald jar, the upwelling jar, as you all know what they are. And we came out with the amount of copper sulfate to use was 20 parts per million for his egg situation. Okay, and then we did it with Dunn's Fish Farm, which is the biggest largemouth bass producer for food fish in the world. And we came up with 20 parts per million. And then also some work over in West Virginia that we've done with rainbow trout to treat those daily for a month through their hatching season. So people are also using it on walleye. So it's a good, safe compound that we've done all this research on to show that it is safe on the eggs. It can be toxic though, and that's the reason I think that people don't use it, because the toxicity of it used to be related by the EPA, used to be related to the hardness of the water. But the hardness of the water doesn't have that much to do with the toxicity of it. It's the alkalinity of the water. So in the studies that we've done there, we looked at the toxicity of it in different reconstituted waters, so we can scale through that. So I don't know if I have time to go into all this, but about the treatment rate and the rate that you're not supposed to use it below, but we're trying to refine that in our labs with some of the studies that we're doing now. I had an introduction put together that has been used in history for a long time. But as I said, I think that the reason that people quit using it, it was effective, but if they misused it, it could be very toxic to the fish. So Fred Meyers, who has been talked about here at the lab, Billy Griffin, who hired me in Stuttgart, contacted Fred Meyers and asked Fred Meyers, what's the history of copper sulfate? How did people come up with these calculations? And basically, he wrote a letter back to Billy, and in this letter, and I've got a copy of it, it's detailed how people came up with the concentration of total alkalinity divided by 100 is how you needed to treat. And basically, it was a group of the old guys, the old extension agents, sitting around in the back room of a meeting, probably at a bar with beers, it said in this letter. And not long after the meeting, when they decided how it worked in certain waters, the Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, started coming out with little pamphlets, and they told about how much copper to use at different alkalinities. And that's where the alkalinity portion came into play. And the first time I could find a report, this was in one of my very early manuscripts that I typed up, Randy McMillan had it in a chapter of Craig Tucker's Channel Catfish book to use it at total alkalinity divided by 100 concentration. So we need to find out more information about where this came from. And we talked to Randy yesterday afternoon, and Randy had a few things to say about that. But anyway, so our study, basically we're looking at 12 different species of fish, warm water fish. We also have done trout, walleye is one of the things we're looking at. And we are taking reconstituted water. Toxicity of copper has been looked at tremendously, but it's always, some people report only the hardness of their water. Some people report the hardness and alkalinity, but we wanted to look at a full scale of things. But it's always in somebody in particular's water. Well, we wanted to look at it in a water that everybody could do research with. So we took and got looked through the APHA manual, the American Public Health Association, and we got recipes to make reconstituted water. So we have very soft water all the way up to the very hard water. And the species are listed here that we've done. And the ones that are in blue are the ones that we've already looked at. So we're using 2 to 3 inch fingerlings to go through this experiment, and we're doing it in our lab at Stuttgart. So that's the reason why we look at the LC50. You can see when you treat with a high concentration and very, very high hardness and alkalinity water, a lot of the tenorite falls out, and this is the milky stuff I was talking about when I was out with Craig. That falls out, and it can actually cover the fish, but the fish are fine through it. Anyway, so I have results here, and you can see the trend as the alkalinity is increased, the toxicity is not quite as bad, and we're also looking at the effect that doesn't, or the concentration that does not affect the fish. So I'll just go through these real quick, and you can see most of them, they follow the same pattern. The interesting thing about largemouth bass are very, and we worked with some people in Kentucky on this, largemouth bass are very resistant. It's unexplainably kind of, they're very resistant to copper sulfate. So we went back and Sean Coyle up there in Kentucky had done some of this research. So he is now publishing that research. And he also found that if you have largemouth bass in with channel catfish, some of that resistance to copper sulfate or lowering of the toxicity of copper sulfate is given to the channel catfish as well. So that's one of the things we're going to be looking into. So anyway, as I said, right now you can use copper sulfate. Copper sulfate's not approved, but it's okay to use while we're doing research trying to get it finished. So on this one, there's a few of the fish we've done that the experiment didn't work out right, and we're repeating this like in the hard water. So anyway, I guess sorry I didn't get to cover much. One of the other things that I wanted to mention is in the future there's going to be a compound called peracetic acid that, in case you haven't heard of it before, become familiar with it. It's a combination of hydrogen peroxide and acetic acid. It's brewed under pressure, and it's a very potent disinfectant to be used. And we're trying to get a manufacturer to commit and get an EPA registration to use this as a disinfectant on harvesting equipment and culture tanks. And I got an email from the lady earlier this month and earlier this week, and she anticipates the registration for the harvesting equipment to be approved next month. So I'm really excited about that. But anyway, sorry I take much time, and if you have any questions about it, I'd love to talk to you after a while. I'd love to talk about copper
We got a
sulfate.
break coming up at 10:45, so that'd be an opportunity to talk with Dave about this. And so this is for a disinfectant in this compound.
Peracetic acid.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very
Okay.
much.